All right, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast. This is a new podcast. I actually haven't told Pete about this, so Pete is new to hear this as well. So we actually have three podcasts on the Fantasy Labs podcast network. We have the Fantasy Labs podcast, which originally started as just kind of an interview. I did an interview with Pete at the very beginning when we first started it back in like June or July of last year. Started this interview where we talked game theory and all sorts of stuff. It eventually became Slate Breakdown. But we wanted to separate those, so the Fantasy Labs pod will still exist, and it will be interviews, and I'm doing an interview tomorrow, so look for that later this week. The Daily Fantasy Flex is a podcast that is now taking place right now, and it will be out. We're going to have, obviously, NBA pods to the end of the season. We're going to have this PGA one on Tuesday. We're going to have 4 MLB pods per week starting next month, so we're going to have a lot of those, but the Daily Fantasy Flex is going to be your spot for all time-sensitive slate breakdowns, daily plays for stuff. So that includes this pod, and then obviously we'll have the DFS roundtable that Matt Freeman hosts as well. And I'm going to write up a post kind of explaining all that, but just kind of want to give a quick breakdown of what this new podcast is going to be. And without further ado, let me introduce our PGA guest. This is the inaugural PGA podcast, which I've been excited about. I've been doing a lot of NBA pods, and it's nice to have a little change of pace, even though I'm still learning PGA. I'm here with two esteemed guests. Peter Jennings is our first one, CSU Ram 88. He's expert in every sport, including PGA, so he's joining us on these Tuesday pods. Pete, what's going on, man?
Exciting week of DFS, ready for PGA coming up here. I'll be watching a lot of sports over the next couple months. I'm actually having surgery tomorrow. So I'll be watching a lot of DFS, a lot of sports, and definitely excited to watch pretty much every tournament in golf going forward since I won't be able to play. So excited for this specific tournament, and DraftKings has some big prize pools.
True. Some big, definitely big tournaments coming up. PGA DFS is growing a ton, so I'm glad that our tools just came out, and obviously we have Colin now, who is the next guest. Nice segue. Colin Davey, who we had on the pod, on the Fantasy Labs pod last week, kind of previewed our tools and got to know Colin a little bit. We talked about the fact that he won the Sloan Hackathon in 2015. And he was going to defend his title in 2016. And what do you know? Colin did it. He took it down.
Oh, yeah.
He's got it on the screen if you are watching.
Bryan, you're going to have to talk a little louder. I can't hear you over the sound of how large and awesome this trophy is. A little bit louder would be nicer. Thank you.
Wow. All right, Colin bringing it hot already. Wow.
Yeah. No, I think that my favorite part of this whole thing was with the trophy ceremony. When I got this on stage, I got it, and I took a picture with Daryl Morey, the Rockets GM who runs this conference.
Sure.
And I definitely asked him if we could give this as like a wrestling title belt next year. So that's my suggestion box. I got a kick out of that. So that was kind of a fun moment.
Love it. Well, congrats, obviously. Winning that 2 years in a row. You're the only person that's ever won it.
I am the only person that's ever. Well, no, there's a student division, so technically, that
doesn't count.
Win is there. But open division, yes, I'm the only person to ever win the Sloan Hackathon in the open division.
Wow, that's big. And so you weren't able to talk about it last time, but apparently you were telling me off the air it's about like high school sports.
So the problem set this year was they gave us tracking data for the Under Armour high school prospect game, XY data for like all 22 players on the field, and they said tackle one of 5 problem sets, and mine was grading offensive line performance. And so it put together a dashboard that basically used some vector math to project people's velocity vectors on the distance vectors from defender to ball carrier and calculate time to impact for every single defensive player on the field and use that as a metric to grade how well offensive lines were doing. And I had some pretty cool animations where it was, running a play and color coding defenders according to their like impact metric, and you could pinpoint exactly the moment when the line failed in every single play. So it was pretty fun.
That's awesome. Pete, what are your thoughts on that?
That is absolutely awesome because I'm a huge line of scrimmage guy just in general, and I think it's one of the most underrated aspects of DFS. I think most people, especially when they're looking at the NFL, don't think about that. So cool to hear that Colin did that, and that's definitely the highlight of the week for me is learning from Colin about PGA. He introduced something that I thought was true today on Twitter, which I know we'll dive into and with his article. So
Yeah.
it's going to be fun to learn from someone like Colin, getting smarter on this pod.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so we're going to have this podcast every Tuesday night, and it's going to release probably late Tuesday night, but we're really going to, push it out Wednesday, so you can have it in time before Thursday morning lock. And we're going to, break down the course. We're going to break down players by tiers, and we're going to kind of get into all the nitty gritty. So we'll make sure to get you all the things that you'll need before setting your lineups on Thursday. So let's jump right into it. So the tournament that we're talking about this week is the Arnold Palmer Invitational, which takes place in Bay Hill Golf Course in Florida. So I'll kind of just kick to you guys, and I'll start with you, Colin, just kind of talking about kind of what course it is. And, we kind of briefly mentioned in our podcast last week, just kind of the importance of course history. I'll kind of give briefly the recent winners here is, the last 2 years, Matt Every has won both 2015 and 2014, and then 2 years prior, Tiger Woods have won, and in 2011 was Martin Laird. So we have, 3 winners in the last 5 years. But yeah, so Colin, we kind of discussed how important course is to PGA DFS. So just kind of interested in your thoughts on this particular course, and then kind of maybe expanding on that conversation that we had last week.
Yeah, so I guess there are 2 parts, like you mentioned, course history and course fit. One is kind of the straightforward, how do they do, and then the other kind of is a more nebulous, how do certain types of players do on this kind of course. Course history is an interesting one. I approach it in a couple different ways. I think most people kind of focus on top 10 finishes as kind of their go-to, like how good do they do there. But course history is I think a lot more dynamic and range than that. And that's kind of one of the things that we pushed on the FantasyLabs product, is that if you get something like average course Z-score over time, that kind of gives you a fuller range of the idea of how often they do. So like if someone averages like a 10, a 72, and a 36 or something like that, I think something like average finish is more important than, say, number of top 10s, because that those top 10 finishes are so noisy and so full of variance that you have to look at, I guess, their full range. I think I think sample size is also important. I think it's kind of an open question as far as, for example, what is a better course history, like 1 top 5 finish or 2 finishes in like the top, in 40 to 50, or 5 finishes in top 40 to 50. So it's kind of a nebulous area that most people don't get into, but I think it's kind of an open question as far as exploring, like, how do you reconcile both kind of sample size and like quality and quantity of finish.
Yeah, and I think it's something that, now that we have a lot of the data and the trends tool, obviously at FantasyLabs up, and obviously be a part of it. We have it in beta, and we would love for you to test it out. So go on the site and, play with all the tools. But yeah, I think it's going to be something that our tools is going to be interesting. We can do some studies. We can try to figure out, just how important course history and all the sort of questions are. Pete, where do you kind of lean on that? Do you put a lot of weight into the course and the course history, or is it just something that you put more just into the stats and how guys are playing?
So I think I probably weight course history a little bit more than the average person. I particularly weight heavily if there's a reason why the course history would make sense. Like if the course aligns really well with a player's style, like Bubba Watson at Augusta, a lefty who can hit the ball a mile with a huge fade, score well at the par 5s, that makes sense to me. Or, the course fits well in addition to they're from that area. So like Stenson, for example, this week is from the area. So things like that I'll really weigh. If I know that this player's played the course, hundreds of times or whatever it is, I'll definitely consider that if they've had good history. In terms of the question of would I rather have, a top 5 finish and then like a miscut or 2 made cuts, it's tough. I have no idea, really, and I'd be just speculating which one's better. The interesting thing about this tournament is pretty standard. I think top 70 move on, and there's about 120 golfers in the field. So it's not an extreme week, but, about 58, 60%, somewhere in that range will make the cut. So I know I'm kind of just going a little bit of a tangent here, but in terms of just straight course history, I do think it's important, but I weigh it differently based on the circumstances.
Interesting. Okay. So this particular course, do you guys have any really insights into this one? Obviously, they've been on this Florida leg. They've been playing in Florida. It's hot. It's apparently going to have some rain this week. You guys have any insights to this course and kind of how it sets up this week?
Yeah, so I think if you look at conventional wisdom, they said it's not a bomber-heavy course. It's kind of more of an accuracy-driven course. And from kind of an initial pass at kind of trends and trying to figure out course fit, the data actually does support that. So conventional wisdom is holding up pretty well. The two that pop, if I had to roughly guess which ones are most important here, are driving accuracy and GIR. Those are the ones that kind of pop the most for me in terms of who's hitting above or below expectation.
And GIR stands for what, Colin?
Green in regulation. How often you hit the green and with less than 2 strokes to go for putting.
Cool.
Greens in regulation is a stat that I like a lot, and it's a statistic that actually models pretty well based on our data, especially recent greens in regulation. So I think that I'm pretty bullish on that statistic as well for this week. And from what I've read as well, it sounds like a lot of the holes, you actually won't be able to hit driver. There's certain spots where you shouldn't be hitting driver off, and it really, leans on the accuracy side. So I think that makes sense from what you're saying, Colin.
Yep, and it's nice to know that it's supported by the data as far as the right things trending out. So now it's just the nice thing about once you know the data fits is you can have a better idea of how much to weight that kind of stuff, and or whether or not it's priced in, which we'll get to when we discuss certain players.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get to players for sure in just a little bit. But yeah, I do think it's important to kind of, you mentioned GIR and some of these stats, for people who may not be as well versed into PGA DFS or just PGA in general. I think there's a lot of good places. We've put out a bunch of tutorials, on our YouTube page, and we've also posted them on the site. We have 5 or 6 tutorials. Colin, you're writing some stuff on our stats. We have, definition of stats in our player models. We also have a glossary of PGA stats that we put out. So a bunch of ways if you go onto the site and want to test out the beta that you can figure out what these stats mean, how important they are and stuff. But kind of want to dive into just a couple of specific stats because Colin, you were once revered PGA DFS guy last week on the pod, but now you're now hated PGA Twitter enemy online, because of your article. So I want to give you a chance to defend yourself. So you wrote an article about shots gained and
strokes gained.
Strokes gained. Yeah, strokes gained. And I want you to defend yourself because a lot of people have the opinion of how dare you.
Right. So I probably led with a little bit more of a fastball than intended with titling my article "Strokes Gained is Overrated." So okay, I'm not. It's and I guess one of the other reactions, people assume we're being inflammatory, this is a Skip Bayless thing for the sake of a hot take, and no, it's really not that. It's just kind of one of the frustrations that kind of got me into doing this analysis in the first place is just coming at this with no assumptions and seeing what's important and what isn't. And strokes gained was one of those things that everybody seems to use. And I just couldn't I thought, okay, let's take a look at it. And after it got sitting on the data, so the case against strokes gained is pretty much it's a 3-parter. One, you can get close enough by massaging and adjusting conventional stats. 2, the stuff where you can't get close enough doesn't actually matter all that much in predicting DFS success. And 3, it's not available for non-PGA stats or for non-PGA tournaments. So there are huge gaps in data from non-PGA players that you're just not able to reconcile that with. So that's the case in 3 parts. The article is somewhere in FantasyLabs. I'm sure you can find it under our golf section.
It's the top article. Yeah, for sure.
But the biggest kind of reaction I got, and I think the mistake I made is kind of not explaining the first part well enough, where I'm comparing strokes gained to essentially adjusted conventional data. I'm not saying strokes gained is just a terrible metric in general or something like driving accuracy or driving distance or these vanilla stats are better. I'm saying that if you take conventional stats and adjust them, if you compare something like strokes gained tee to green, which is the go-to everybody loves, is kind of this overall measure, compare that against normalized and adjusted like strokes per round, Z-scores essentially. And if you swap those in for your players and your models, and you try to see how much they're weighting, they come out really close to each other. So, and I think that all else being equal, like if you could get exactly the accuracy of strokes gained versus from conventional data, why wouldn't you opt for the data source where you have better data quality and you can get it from all tours? So that's the point I'm trying to make. And I'm sure there'll be lots of back and forth in the coming days because people like strokes gain seems to be everywhere and it's built into a lot of people's approaches.
Yeah, that's interesting. Pete, where do you fall in this kind of argument? Are you a big strokes gain guy, or do you agree with Colin that it might be potentially overrated, maybe in comparison to what we can do in our models?
So I think overall, the DFS community thinks it knows a lot more about golf than we actually do. I think it's tough. I think there's a lot of variance in golf. I think that trying to think about how to exactly phrase this, but I think that people are overestimating certain things as just tried and true and absolutely correct. I have looked at strokes gained a lot in the past, especially like strokes gained putting on certain courses. I think is valuable, but I'm definitely open-minded to a different approach. And what Colin's saying totally makes sense to me, especially since we don't have the data. So basically saying, hey, if we have something that can, a statistic that can basically do the same thing as strokes gained and it has better data and more complete data, why not use that? That makes sense to me. So it definitely goes against what I kind of looked at in the past. But again, I was speculating a lot on what matters. And I was kind of coming up with my own weights and subjectively making decisions on what golfers I liked in playing DFS. I think a lot of people are doing that.
Sure.
I think, in a sport like baseball, you can back test a lot more. There's so much more data out there. We can be, fairly certain things mean a lot. But in golf, I think that we're getting there, but I don't think the DFS community is as knowledgeable as they generally appear to be. So, Colin, I'm sure you'll get a lot of people coming after you, and I'm excited to learn from you personally because you've done a lot of digging into this.
Yeah, and again, to emphasize, the whole point of that article was that I'm like, I kind of ended it with, if I thought strokes gain with this, like I called it a massive fountain of edge that was supposed to give everyone like their winning lineups, like I would include it and kind of say it's worth the trouble. But even in the examples that everyone was throwing out on Twitter today, where it's like, oh no, we can't grade the Euro guys, like nobody's walked me through a case of like, what do you do for a player when you're missing strokes gain data? Like the closest methodology I've seen is kind of like this ham-fisted, like, oh, we'll kind of approximate driving distance and driving accuracy and kind of fill in the gaps as best we know how. The idea that you can kind of fill in strokes gain gaps accurately with conventional data is like, A, I don't really think anybody has a tried and true methodology for doing that because they're not matching them up and kind of projecting them properly. And B, if you're doing that anyway, like, why not just use that for data in the first place? If you're kind of like approximating it from conventional stats, you can weight it with recency a lot more often. You can do like better adjustments. And it's kind of proving the point that it's not the end all be all metric. It's at best kind of this supplementary type of thing.
Yeah, no, I completely, I respect that a ton. And I do really like that, at FantasyLabs, we have this data and we have it in models and we have it in trends and we have it adjusted for salary. So we have it in so many ways that you can actually like look at this data and figure stuff out for yourself. Like if you disagree with something on this pod, we're going to do it every Tuesday. Like go in and check it yourself. Like that's what FantasyLabs is about, is building your own models, building your own lineups, and we're giving you the tools, but you're doing your own lineups, you're doing your own research. So if you really think strokes gained is important, like obviously use it. You don't have to necessarily agree with us, but we're not going to just take conventional wisdom and agree with it just because it's conventional wisdom. We're going to, test the data, and we're going to try to give you guys honestly our best thoughts. So I appreciated that article, Colin, and I thought it was well written and well said, and I'm excited about more articles in the future. Let's kind of move on to maybe just kind of the tournament on hand, the Arnold Palmer Invitational, obviously this week, and I think we're gonna break it down every week just by tiers. I think that makes the most sense for PGA. If we find something that makes more sense, we'll obviously adapt. But I think for now, I think it makes most sense to just kind of group these guys into tiers. Obviously, PGA can be top heavy with some of these, elite guys who win a lot of the tournaments. But you obviously, in order to get them in your DFS lineups, you have to find some value plays. So the tiers that I have broken down is guys who are 9K or more on DraftKings, guys who are between 7 and 8.9, and guys who are 6.9 or less. So we will kind of move along those tiers, and I'll let Colin and Pete kind of hash it out. So let's start with the kind of the top tier, the 9K or more guys. And Pete, I'll start with you. In that range, who's standing out to you this week in the Arnold Palmer Invitational?
I mean, that's the thing. A lot of these guys stand out looking at the top. I mean, I really like Adam Scott, the form that he's in. I've been messing around with some models on FantasyLabs, and he's ranking extremely well. His ball striking is incredible right now. He's definitely, in the best current form. He's won the last 2 tournaments that he's played, and the putter has been a lot better. So definitely a big fan of Adam Scott, and the data is backing him up. If I'm going to go a little bit cheaper than Adam Scott, I like Henrik Stenson. I think he'll be a really popular play this week. He's from the area. There's a lot of reasons to like him. His ball striking is really good. And just watching him last week, he could have scored so well if he just made, even a couple of those, like 4 or 5 footers last week. So I think he's a guy that I'm definitely interested in. And then in addition to that, you can make an argument for a lot of the guys like Matsuyama, Justin Rose, I think a lot of people will like. But for me, another guy that I think is interesting and will be a little bit lower owned is Ryan Moore. I like the form that he's in, and he's rating pretty well in my models as well.
Cool, Colin. Yeah, 9K guys are higher. So I mean, there's not a ton of them. I think there's about maybe 10 guys or so. But who stick out? Maybe is your best plays, and maybe I don't know if they're I don't know, maybe if you think about them as cash versus GPPs. Maybe guys are more consistent, and maybe some of these guys are more volatile, or maybe the elite guys in DFS are just kind of always consistent. I'm not incredibly well versed in PGA yet, but maybe that's the case where all these guys are kind of good cash plays every week.
I actually kind of go the opposite. In terms of cash plays, I lean mostly away from the top end guys. And the reason is pretty simple. Golf is so random that there is no such thing as a safe cash play in golf. The variance is just that high. And usually on average, the top guys don't tend to cash out on average high enough to justify their high price tag. So I've been running a couple things, and I think they're great for upside in terms when you need to figure out how to get the tournament winner, and then maybe pick a couple flyers for I think that work great for GPPs. But no, I actually have a bias against the top guys in cash. As far as the specific people, I ran it through mine, and I actually have Adam Scott as one of the worst cash guys, or one of the worst top guys, and Jason Day as one of the better ones. And I know exactly why. And Peter, I want to get your thoughts on this too. It's because if you look at Adam Scott's game log, for example, he still has this log of data back around August to right in the middle of August, where it's 2 bad finishes and 2 missed cuts. And there's a couple other poor finishes in between, Sony Open, and then but his last 3, he's just been really good. So that's kind of the open-ended debate on recent versus historical. I think if the people recent form is important, but I think people still weighted a little bit too higher than it actually should be. And so just from a pure long-term results perspective, Adam Scott has this albatross around his neck of this poor long-term results. It's not that far off in the distance. So that's why he's popping low. Similarly, Jason Day, although he's not great recently, he still has that insane stretch from earlier this summer where he was just playing at a super high level. And so he's down to 10.8 now, when he was 12.5 over the summer. It kind of rates as from my end as maybe a little bit too much of a salary drop off, and he is showing a little bit of value. So I guess, Peter, where do you come at that with if there's a backlog of kind of mediocre results, how do you know when it's truly supposed to go away or not? Because that seems more like a subjective decision.
Absolutely a subjective decision. And one thing you can definitely utilize, for sure in daily fantasy is everyone has a recency bias. I think everyone overweights recent form just because that's, most current thing in their brain is how they performed recently. And I'm certainly guilty of it. And, it's applicable in pretty much every sport. And the one thing too in daily fantasy is generally salaries are moving pretty quickly based on the most recent form. So for that reason, you would, in this circumstance, kind of fade Adam Scott and go after Jason Day. I have nothing bad to say about Jason Day, but with Adam Scott specifically, this is where I would make a subjective decision and say, hey, his putting looks dramatically better. He has this new approach, this new process. And I think the putting in the past, when he moved away from the belly putter into a traditional putter, he struggled so much that threw off the rest of his game mentally. But just playing golf and, it just I know this is not a good argument at all. This is not a data argument, but just one of those things where, hey, I've seen, an experienced, getting mentally right in golf, and his putting is dramatically improved. So it's tough. I still like Adam Scott quite a bit at the top, but I think he'll be a really popular play. And I definitely think in tournaments, it makes a lot more sense to play Jason Day.
Yeah, no, I think that, you're absolutely right. It's not a decision. That's the whole point of essentially why I'm asking you, because that's something that just the pure data doesn't pick up. I don't know from looking at just the results that he switched up his putter method. And I guess I approach all of that stuff with a lot of skepticism, because it seems that when people are doing picks and course previews, everybody can latch on to something that's changed and kind of explains recent results. It's kind of like the same phenomenon as in spring training in baseball, the best shape of his life articles.
Right, yeah.
Everybody's lost 30 pounds. Everybody's gone gluten-free. It's all going to be different this year. And I don't there's so many bad reasons why whatever you think is actually going to make a difference will not actually make a difference. And I'm the first to admit I'm not great at picking out what those subjective decisions are. That's more for someone like you who can see, kind of just watch the game and kind of think critically about, okay, what will make a difference, what not. Even with putting, for example, there's that whole school of thought in golf that says putts within 15 feet are basically luck. And so even if you say oh, he's improved his putting, how much of that is, noise versus signal? And that is somewhere where I have no problem betting strokes gained is probably adding some huge amount of value, or not huge amount of value, but it'll tell you maybe if that's a BABIP type of thing. I still don't think that putts inside 15 feet is shouldn't be a slider that's 15 in the slider model or something like that. I think it's 2 or 3 tops, but yeah, that's why I'm asking you that. It is a subjective decision.
I think you might have offended the strokes game people more by calling it a BABIP stat than actually than useless. I think they would probably just prefer useless at that point.
Yeah, no, I'd say it'd be okay by saying strokes gained putting within 15 feet is a BABIP type stat where it's all luck, not the whole
That's
thing.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's interesting because you and I talked about the kind of the similarities between PGA and MLB, last week, and I think that makes sense. Just kind of I've been looking through our models and player cards and stuff, and the consistency, especially if you're used to a sport like NBA, where the consistency of the top players is ridiculous. LeBron never, he never goes below 40 fantasy points, whereas even these top guys, Rory just missed a cut, 2 tournaments ago. LeBron never is going to just stop playing at halftime. We talked about this in the pod. So it's just, a different sport altogether. But yeah, definitely interesting, especially if, if a stat can be sort of kind of a BABIP sort of stat, BABIP as in, kind of measures luck. But yeah, that's certainly interesting. I think maybe worth a study in the future for sure. Cool. Any last thoughts on these kind of elite guys, 9K guys, or you want to move to the kind of the middle range?
I want to get a question out real quick. So I wanted to ask you what you're doing the strokes gain too. And now this is the perfect thing. So you go into just strokes gain putting specifically, Colin.
Mm-hmm.
You see someone dramatically improve, like an Adam Scott recently, right? Obviously, it's only a couple of tournaments, and obviously there can be a lot of noise. There can be a lot of luck in that. That's where I personally would argue with you most. How would you defend? Do you think it's reasonable to think that that's really not really valuable, but valuable? Basically, if someone's improved in strokes gained putting, over let's say a relatively big sample, how much would you value that versus not basically ignoring that or thinking it's a noisy stat?
The short answer is I don't know necessarily. It's a good question. It's open-ended. I think maybe some of those softer arguments, like where you say like, oh, he switched up the putting type, or you can like visibly see a difference in his approach, that would probably be more of like something that's pushing it towards like, oh, that's signal instead of noise. But I guess my bias is just kind of treat it very conservatively and say it's all like it's all noise until I get a pretty decent sample size, like maybe like 6 to 8 or something like that.
Right. And I didn't frame the question perfectly, but I do think that like with Adam Scott specifically, he goes from a belly putter to a non-belly putter. His putting falls off a cliff, and now given some more time to practice and really work on it, he's getting better. That subjectively makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, and I'm the first to admit that's not something that's picked up in the data in the slightest.
Okay.
Interesting. So maybe it's not even necessarily a batter thing. Maybe it's a batter versus pitcher thing, where it's like a question of whether the data is useful. But then the really important question is how much value are you getting out of it? Because if everyone is on the fact that his putter is now this magical thing where he has the confidence, he's got this new putter, he's doing it differently and it's going to work. That's great in a vacuum. Obviously, like if you're playing against just yourself, that's great. You're going to maximize your fantasy points. But if everyone knows that, are you getting any value out of it? And really, that's the important thing, especially in DFS where it's a zero-sum game. If everyone knows it and he's going to be super high owned, then it's really not that useful for us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, yeah, interesting topic for sure, and something I'm sure we'll debate as the pods continue. Okay, let's keep on moving to this kind of mid-range, and we'll classify this mid-range as 7,000 to 8-9 on DK. And since we started with Pete on the last one, Colin, I'll start with you this time. Kind of in that range, who stands out for you this week in the Invitational?
The two guys that jump for me are Brendan Steele and Ryan Palmer. And it's almost a counterintuitive take here, because Ryan Palmer doesn't fit well on course fit, and he has a pretty lousy course history. So like, why would he ever pop? It's because normally he's like a 9K type of player. And clearly the prices or the futures market or whatever have like appropriately downgraded him. I think they've downgraded him too much in terms of his average projection. Is it worth like a $1,500 drop as far as course fit and course history? I don't think so. I think he's still a fundamentally like decent, like top 25 player overall right now. And I think they're kind of overvaluing the price drop. So what's the double negative, whatever that term is.
Yeah.
And then Brendan Steele, not as much as an extreme version, but yeah, I think he's a guy that generally pops like more often in kind of like that average, generally expected to do well. He doesn't have a great course fit or history either. Not as bad as Palmer, but he just tends to be one of those guys where like maybe not necessarily like not super high upside and great odds to win, but like solid chance of a finish every single week.
Interesting. And before we move on to Pete, just kind of one other guy I want to ask you about. Obviously, the two-time defending champ, Matt Every, is priced up at 7.5. It's a guy who isn't. I mean, I'll be honest in this podcast that like you guys are the golf experts. I'm learning and I'm figuring out the data. Doesn't seem like a great golfer. Is usually in like the bare minimum price at 6K. Usually doesn't even make cuts at a lot of these tournaments, but for some reason has won this tournament 2 years in a row. So because of that, they've priced him up $1,500 up to 7.5. I'm assuming because of course history. So
yes. Is
that just an easy fade for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Just no further explanation required. Matt Every is a generally not good golfer. That's way too high of a price bump. He is the easy fade on the board.
Okay. Yeah.
Especially in tournaments. He's going to be heavily owned. I mean, that's just something that, a 5 minutes of research and just all of our biases coming to fruition.
Yes.
Take Matt Every. Yeah. That people are going to do that. He's going to be very, very heavily owned. And I like two golfers right at that exact same price range, like Colin mentioned as well. I really like Steele. He's popping quite a bit in my model, and I like Palmer as well. He's popping too. The one guy who is rated third in my model right now that I like, he's near the top of that range, is Paul Casey. Also, early line movement is favoring him as well. And that's a question for you too, Colin. How much
Yeah.
are you paying attention to line movement? Because that is probably one of the biggest things that I'm paying attention to when doing daily fantasy golf.
I've started incorporating line movement a lot more. And I think since I don't make a lot of subjective decisions, I think reverse line movement is a great way to capture like a pure data, probably to capture those subjective decisions of essentially the market as kind of like a tie-breaking metric, or if you're between like 10, 15 lineups and they all look the same to you, I think reverse line movement captures a lot of the tiebreaker aspect to it. So I'm a big fan.
So one of you guys. So I know what reverse line movement means in terms of like NBA. So like for example, if like the Golden State Warriors are 8-point favorites and they're getting 90% of the bets on their spread, but the spread is actually moving away from the Warriors, that's a reverse line movement, and it kind of infers that some sharp money is on whoever their opponent is, because even if the majority of the bets are on the Warriors, it's actually moving away from them. So that's a reverse line movement in NBA, but I actually don't know what one is in PGA. So I would love for you guys to explain that to not only our listeners, but to me as well.
Pete, you want to take that one? I took the last one.
Sure. So basically what I'm looking, with golf in particular, I'm looking at, basically what I was referencing, I'm not sure exactly would be, defined as reverse line movement, but basically I'm looking for guys who start at a certain price and their price gets better because more money's coming on them, whether it be sharp money or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is interesting is you can follow if a price of a player is not moving. Let's say like someone's a pretty popular like Keegan Bradley has really good history or something like that,
mm-hmm.
and the public's all betting him and his line's not moving. That would be an indicator that they're not playing well. Colin, what do you?
Interesting. Okay.
Reverse line move is not something that I normally think about in golf.
Oh that's just you described. That's what I call a reverse line movement. You described exactly what I call it. So yep. Okay. Everything you said.
Yeah. So that's more what I was wondering is, it's kind of easy to tell where the public's on. That's the case for any sport. You can always just kind of look at percentage of bets really on any sort of betting site and figure out just kind of exactly where the public's on. But obviously we're more concerned where the sharp guys are on. So potentially, what you said is maybe a situation where a guy, his odds are moving, but there's not a whole lot of money on him. So that means that maybe some heavy sharp money's on them or something like that.
What I'm looking for is especially late big movement. And that means that in general, big positions have been made on players. And oftentimes that'll come in, pretty late. So that's something that I'm really paying attention to. And you can also kind of track the line movement of players throughout the week as well, which can be valuable and definitely something that personally I value a lot because that's a big part of my process just in all of DFS is I really take into account what sharp books are doing because that's their business. Interesting.
So Colin, is kind of the line movement important? Because as we talked about in our pod last week, the correlation, just kind of salary to Vegas odds is, it's probably not 100%, not a 1, but it's near perfect correlation of how DraftKings prices their players is almost perfectly correlated with their Vegas odds to win the tournament. So is that kind of why you value line movement so much, is because you're getting the inefficiency that they've already released the prices and now we're actually seeing the true movement of how the players are valued by Vegas? Therefore, you can kind of find the inefficiencies in the pricing.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly it. I think we've covered it's all sorts of value reasons. Like I said, I mostly use it as a kind of subjective check about, if I'm differentiating between lineups, if you just add up the total line movement, all of your players and kind of see which ones pops the most. I think it's also a great way to check your process. So like, let's say that you have like 15 lineups like that you like at the start of the week, because you can run your model in like FantasyLabs and, check to see like, okay, here's the guys that I think that I like. At the end of the week, you can say, okay, here's my initial guess. How did the market react? Are all of my guys generally moving in the right direction? If they're not, then maybe you need to rethink about like what goes into your model and how you're weighting things. So it's a great way to kind of grade yourself internally as well.
Yep.
Cool.
I agree with that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good discussion. Not even anything I had on my outline, but I think it's a
Yeah,
good
and no, and really quick, I forgot Paul Casey's on the group too, and Peter, but just I agree with that pick as well. I have him just above Steele and Palmer, so I think we have our exact same three.
Yeah. I'm using a lot of stuff from FantasyLabs, but I'm really weighting greens and regulation. That's something that I'm looking at heavily, and that's to just go back to one expensive guy. That's another reason people are really bullish on Stenson.
Yep.
All right, sounds great. Okay, so let's move to the lower tier. Obviously, especially on DraftKings, with the salary cap, you have to, if you want to get one of these top guys, whether it's Stinson or Scott, as Pete likes, or Rory at the top, you're going to have to find guys who are really cheap in the kind of the 6K range. So this next tier that we'll talk about, and we'll kind of keep it on these same tiers every week. The lowest tier is the 6, 9, or less. So these are kind of the bargain guys, the ones that you have to get in kind of strike gold, especially in a tournament, to pair them with your top guys in order to take down a GPP. So, Colin, I'll start with you. These bargain barrel guys obviously are priced down for a reason, but are any of these guys rating highly for you? Any you think that could potentially surprise and do well this week?
So I forgot, what's our cutoff for bargain barrel? How low do they have to be?
Has to be under 7K.
Under 7K. Okay. So the highest under 7K guy I have, and it's almost like a weird affirmation of the conventional wisdom, is Will Wilcox, because I know he is.
Okay.
Everybody loves Will Wilcox. Everybody hangs on what's he going to tweet out.
Only pick I have. That's the only pick I have, and freaking.
No, everyone loves Will because he tweets at us.
He's going to be so heavily owned too, especially after his most recent tweet. That was my only piece of analysis, which was terrible. Was Will Wilcox said to fire him in. He's honest with us. He's told us not to play him.
That's the thing. Yeah, he's super honest. Like when he's like not feeling well, he'll say like, "Don't play me," which I think is awesome. It's so funny.
All right, just because Wilcox is ever going to have him anyway. All right, let's pick someone we might not otherwise pick, just to make it interesting. Okay.
All right.
The guy that everyone loved last week and continues it now is Hudson Swafford. He was 5,900 last week, which just seems super absurdly low, and he's still kind of popping or pretty high. I think he has he's in decent form lately. He's like one of those, like he makes a decent amount of cuts. Like I think I like him. The other one that's like super interesting in the under 6,000 is Tony Finau, who is, I think, actually have the pure best value on the board. And I know he's super inconsistent. That's the knock on him at all times.
Sure.
But I think it's just weird to see someone who has that good of a driving distance under 6,000. And I know bombers aren't like important on this course, but they're like at the same time there is the other school of thought about how like driving distance is the single most like repeatable, predictable long-term stat, just because like it's not subject to any of the other noise. And so like no, it's not important, but like I think it's worth a GPP flyer at under 6,000.
Yeah, I mean he's missed 4 cuts in a row, but yeah. So Colin, before we move to Pete and let him take his under 7K guys. So are you just looking for guys who maybe have inconsistency, especially recent play, but maybe the talent for higher than that salary?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm necessarily looking for that or like if it just pops from the data angle naturally, because kind of on the flip side, like same thing with Jason Day. If you have a decent backlog of results where you have like enough top 10, top 20 finishes, like the data's not like, going to assume like you still have that like level inside you and you can't play at that level. So it takes a while to forget that. So I think like, remember Tony Finau was like 8,700 at one point. I think like even in this season and not too long ago. So to be at like 5,900 all of a sudden, I don't think he forgot golf that much in the past couple months where it's just like, we have to drop him below 6,000 now.
Agreed. Okay. So Pete, I'll kick to you. Other than Will Wilcox, who, by the way, goal of the podcast, we're going to have Will on the podcast at some time.
Stretch goals. I like it.
Yeah. I mean, he's
very cool.
Yeah. He's a DFS, his supporter, and he tweets to us, and I think we should have him on. So we'll try to make that happen. But yeah, Pete, 7K and under. Any guys stick out to you?
I'm scrambling now. I mean, I had no analysis in general. I was going to make the funny remark about Wilcox and the whole Twitter thing. I actually saw someone else talking about Finau. A couple of the golf touts out there have made, oh boy, Finau is just taunting us at this price. And I definitely think he's a great tournament play. I mean, you still have to remember birdies and eagles are so critical on DraftKings. It's not the perfect course for him. It doesn't, it's not a big bomber course like Colin mentioned, but he's still going to be able to get to every par 5 and 2, or almost par 5s and 2 relative to the field. And, there's upside there. So he's someone that makes sense. If I have to give someone else that's brand new, I mean, it's pretty ugly with all these guys. In terms of guys who are rated like high in my model, Roberto Castro is the highest guy. I would never take him.
I love Roberto Castro. I disagree. I love him. He's like one of those. He's the poor man's Sean Stefani, where like he'll never win a tournament.
That's why I guess I never take him, is because I never feel like he can ever. He's never going to win for you. But at the same time, if he's going to make enough cuts for you, that's what you really need at that price.
That is a good debate, because Colin and I discussed on the podcast. Colin says that he doesn't really care about who's going to win, and it sounds, Pete, like maybe you disagree, that you want that upside for every golfer.
I mean, I wouldn't say they don't have to be able to win it, but I do want significant upside.
Top 5 upside, maybe.
Yeah, and it's more just about making a lot of birdies and getting a lot of scores. So that's maybe why I haven't considered Castro as much, but I guess I should look at him. He's ranked the highest in my model. So other guys that are rated high are like Blaine Barber, Lucas Glover.
Yep. No, Lucas was right behind Hudson Swafford in mine, so I'd agree with that too.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what the data says based on the model here. So I'll definitely be looking at them. But in general, especially just looking at this, I think that you can make a great lineup that's really balanced. I mean, you have Steele, Palmer, you could throw in Casey, I think, is reasonably priced, and you still have a lot of money to spend for a variety of other guys. So I don't think you have to, do studs and duds this week, especially with some of the value in the mid tier.
Yeah, so as Colin inferred earlier, Pete, do you for your cash games, do you normally go kind of maybe the mid-range guys and just kind of create a balanced lineup of 7 to 8K guys, and then in tournaments, take your swings at the top guys and the bargain ones?
I mean, it totally depends on how the tournament's structured. Like if, a lot of people are going to make the cut, I'll take more risks. But in general, I definitely go with a more balanced approach. And I think a lot of people will do that this week. I think someone we didn't talk about that's going to be heavily owned, curious your opinion on him, Colin, is Zach Johnson. I think a lot of people are going to build these mid-tier kind of lineups. Billy Horschel's another guy at 7,700 that I think people will kind of go to. So we'll see. I definitely, in terms of cash games, my head-to-heads, I'm probably going to do balance this week, but it definitely is not something that's set in stone. It's dynamic to the pricing and the cut structure and just the course. So,
yeah, that is interesting. I actually think that PGA is maybe not unique, but fairly interesting. That I think that maybe of the a bunch of the sports, it's pretty easy to predict ownership data. Or like projected ownership. So maybe something that we can add into this segment is we'll kind of, off the air kind of try to figure out where we think guys are going to be owned, especially in tournaments. And then we can kind of, maybe the top 5 guys, we can kind of yay or nay them. I think that may be useful for people.
Yeah, John and I were actually talking about this a little bit in Boston. Since the PGA is so small, the number of influencers and recommendations is also small. That like if you look at who people are recommending, like anecdotally, it correlates a lot more with ownership in the big tournaments. And so it's still kind of it's not like NFL where you can get your picks from 50 different sources and you kind of have a little bit more diversity. Maybe also like is more dependent on other variables. Like it matters who people are recommending.
Right. No, yeah, I mean that's a great point. So yeah, so the 10 people that listen to this podcast, we will heavily influence for this week. So
yeah, like that's what. Yeah, we're gonna manipulate the market according to everything. I mean that is whatever. Like yeah,
the game theory fades based on just touting and what's out there right now are definitely Every and Wilcox. Those are going to be the 2 most heavily owned. If you're just going to play straight ownership, I do like Wilcox, and I have a feeling Wilcox will be in my cash game. I have a feeling I've built a couple lineups I like with him, and all I gotta say is put me in my.
Yeah, I think he's going to be in mine there too, so that's fine.
All I gotta say to my DFS homies is put me in your lineup. How are you going to say no to that?
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, I mean, he told you to. I mean, what are you going to say?
Mm-hmm.
I hope there's more hot takes too between Colin and I, because I definitely am kind of known for the narrative street, and I do think that the narrative plays a bigger role in sports like football and basketball. I definitely think it's really noisy when there's narratives and things that people, the biases for like a sport like baseball. I'm still trying to learn golf. I think that there's some things that matter a lot. I think like the hot hand theory in baseball is kind of a fallacy. In golf, I'm a pretty big believer in current form. So I'm sure we'll have some fun debates going. I definitely am not as educated and haven't gone through the data like you have, but certainly have some opinions based on just playing DFS and just sports in general. So it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I think that's your subjective decisions are the ones I'm looking forward to the most, just because I'm such a creature of data that like I don't have room for that subjectivity in my process, and figuring out like how to make better, correct subjective decisions is something that I'm looking forward to exploring.
One other thing too, just on that I think you can see subjectively sometimes too, and just read through the news that the data won't pick up, is injuries and like major swing changes. I think that's something to really pay attention to. I think we'll hopefully have some opportunities to say that. But one thing from Tiger Jam last year, one of my coolest conversation with Tiger Woods about predicting golf is he said health and just where people are in terms of injuries is such a huge determinant of how people are going to play. So, I've heard a ton of guys that are, right there, but then their back went out or whatever. So paying attention to that and where they are health-wise, I think would be a big thing for us, especially from the subjective side. Hopefully Colin and FantasyLabs will take care of all the data.
Cool. All right. Well, we can end it there. Yeah, no, I do think this is going to be a fun pod to do on Tuesday. I'm really looking forward to doing it and learning from you guys. I do think that we have a good combo. The data guy that rejects narrative street and gets on Twitter fights and starts all sort of battles with PGA DFS, and then Pete who's gonna battle him. So I do think that we got a good combo, and that we'll add some guests here or there. I know Sean, who is our awesome marketing director, is a big PGA guy. He wants to jump in every once in a while. Of course, we're gonna have Will Wilcox, a friend of the podcast. We're gonna have him on fairly soon. I'm confident in saying that. So. I think we're going to have a good 2016 to PGA and on. So thanks for joining. Do you guys have any final thoughts on the Invitational, or you guys want to end it there?
I'm good. I think good. Peter, any final thoughts?
I'm just excited for this, and definitely not confident in my subjective biases that I've made over the last couple of years playing DFS, but it's going to be fun to kind of test them, and definitely excited to learn a lot from Colin. So thanks again for doing this, Colin, and really pumped for PGA going forward. We're going to have a ton of big prize pools to chase, which is going to be fun with the tools and data and lineup builder on FantasyLabs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Let's go make some money.
Yeah, we'll all learn together. So good luck this week in the Invitational, and play with the tools. It's free right now, and you have a lot of opportunity to play with the trends tools, the player models, build your own model, enter tournaments, and kind of leading up to the Masters in a couple weeks, you have a lot of time to figure out what you want to do and learn PGA. So we'll be here on Tuesday nights, and the site's around. You can play with it every day. So thanks for listening, and good luck this week. We'll talk to you guys next week.